Built by the Scottish yard of Mackie and Thomson at Glasgow for Andrew Weir and Co, Bankline Shipping Company, the Olivebank was launched on the 21st September 1892, 3 months after her sister ship Cedarbank. She was a steel four-masted barque of 2,824 gross tons, 326 feet long, with a breadth of 43.1 feet and a depth of 24.5 feet. The Olivebank was a fine type of the old sailing ship, which was so familiar in days gone by. Her attractive lines show that she was designed with a view to providing full cargo capacity, with due regard to sailing qualities. She was square-rigged on 3 masts, carrying double topgallant sails and royals. She was sparred somewhat heavily, but provision for heavy weather conditions was shown in such details as the topgallant sails, as well as the topsails being clewed to the yardarm. The Olivebank, like many of her contemporaries, built in the late 1880s and early 1890s, was decorated with painted ports that emphasized her fine sheer line. Later, the hull was painted black, with white deck houses. Screw rigging and other fittings show that the vessel was built in the days when labor-saving devices were utilized to increase the efficiency and easy handling of big ships. This is also evident in the iron-standing jib boom, which came into vogue when bowsprits of earlier days were discarded. The crew was housed in the forecastle forward, abaft of which was the house for the donkey boiler, which supplied steam for working the ship at sea and handling the cargo in port. The half-deck was situated farther aft and near to the poop and officers' staterooms. The ship's wheel was covered in to provide better shelter for the helmsman in rough weather. Her first master was Captain J.N. Petrie, but any information on the ship for the next 7 years is presently obscure. This may be due to the fact that during those years when steam ships were rapidly taking the business from sail, it was quite normal to see vast numbers of sailing ships being laid up for long periods of time all around the world. In 1899, the Olivebank left the UK for Chile with coal and then went on to Australia in ballast. In the following year, she made a fast passage from Melbourne to Falmouth in 87 days. In 1903, on a ballast voyage from Shanghai to Royal Roads in British Columbia, the ship lost almost all her masts in the storms. First, a typhoon hit the ship and damaged the rudder. Then she was hit by another storm, and almost the entire rig was lost. After this, 1,200 miles were sailed with the help of an emergency rake. The vessel was sighted near the Farallon Islands off San Francisco on the 22nd of December 1903. Apart from the mizzenmast, there was nothing left of the masts except stumps. The next day, the vessel was towed into San Francisco harbor. In 1906, on the way from Hamburg to Seattle, the ship was caught in a storm, and the apprentice and mate were washed overboard. A second wave threw the mate back on board, but the apprentice drowned. In February 1909, she arrived at Santa Rosalia, California, with coal from South Wales. Under the command of Captain Carse, she later sailed in ballast to Newcastle, New South Wales, and loaded 4,800 tons of coal. Her destination was back to Santa Rosalia, but after she'd arrived there, and while she was lying at anchor in the shallows, it was then discovered that her cargo of coal was on fire. The firefighting tugs came alongside, and after the best part of 2 days put the fire out, but there had been so much water pumped into her hold that the Olivebank ended up sitting on the bottom with little or no freeboard showing. After being refloated and her coal discharged, she went for repairs. Captain Petrie was relieved by Captain David George. But after those repairs had been completed, 4 months later, she was thrown against the Santa Rosalia breakwater in a hurricane on the 29th June 1911. In that accident, 1 sailor was killed, and the rudder was badly damaged, and that necessitated a further delay for repairs. Despite being insured and with commanding a good freight rate on its 4,800-ton cargo, it was a voyage in which the unfortunate ship made a loss for her owner. On completion of the voyage, the Olivebank was sold in August 1913 to E. Monson. The next news of the ship came when she went to Tvedestrands Rederi, J.A. Heinstein, Norway. 2 years later, she went to the Kristiansand Shipping Co. They renamed her Caledonia and also kept her for 2 years before selling her to J. Lorentzen. In 1924, the ship was once again sold after a 2-year period of ownership. This time she went to Gustav Eriksson of Mariehamn, Finland. Captain Eriksson had always been a firm believer that a ship's name should never be changed, so the first thing he did was to give Olivebank her original name back. With no cargoes offering, the Olivebank sailed on spec from her new Mariehamn port of registration to Cardiff looking for a coal cargo. But because there was nothing available anywhere in South Wales, she once again sailed on spec, this time in 93 days to Port Lincoln in ballast under Captain Troberg. After receiving orders to load at Port Victoria, Olivebank loaded wheat and then had a slow 147-day passage back to Falmouth for orders. So slow had the passage been that Captain Troberg wasn't a bit surprised to learn on his arrival that he'd been posted missing by Lloyd's. On discharging, no outward cargoes were available, so once again Olivebank went out to Port Lincoln light ship, looking for a cargo, and once again she took 93 days to get there. With nothing available, her new master, Captain Graneth, received orders that a cargo of guano was awaiting him in the Seychelles. On the 24th April 1926, he sailed his ship from Melbourne for Mahé, arriving there on the 27th June. The cargo was loaded, and he sailed for Dunedin on the 16th August 1926, arriving there on 13th November. From then on, the Olivebank joined in on the grain races with a large number of other sailing vessels. Those grain races had in fact begun in 1921 and ended in 1939. The Olivebank took part in 13 of those grain races, and although she had the capabilities to win, she never won any of them. However, Gustav Eriksson's ships won 18 of the 23 races, which ended at the outbreak of World War II. After having discharged her Australian wheat at Barry Docks, it was on the 29th August 1939, which was 6 days before the declaration of World War II, that Olivebank sailed from Barry to her home port of Mariehamn. However, on her arrival at the South Wales coaling port, a number of apprentices paid off and took a ferry back to Finland. They wanted to be in time for the start of the navigation school. As a result, the short-handed Olivebank left for Mariehamn with a crew of 21. With Finland being a neutral country, a large Finnish flag was painted on each of her ship's sides, as well as the hatch tarpaulins. Just to be on the safe side, her boats were kept swung out. When the ship was off Dover, a British destroyer approached with the information that the Royal Navy had not sown any minefields on Olivebank's proposed route, but strongly suspected that the Germans had. Captain Graneth therefore posted 2 lookouts day and night, one the forecastle head and the other up aloft. 10 days after leaving Barry, and when the ship was in the North Sea, Olivebank ran into a minefield near Bovbjerg off the Danish coast. But because the water was comparatively calm and shallow, the anchored mines, which should have been about 10 feet below the water, were visible and floating on top. On the lookout's 3-bell ring and his verbal report of mine right ahead, Captain Graneth ordered the wheel hard over. The Olivebank missed that mine, but as she swung around, she hit another in position 55 degrees, 53 minutes north, and 5 degrees, 7 minutes east. That was submerged in deeper water. The result of the explosion was catastrophic. Masts, yards, and other spars came crashing down. The ship's empty hold filled rapidly, and the ship quickly developed a port list. So quickly did everything happen that those on board could do nothing except jump over the side and swim for their lives. Nobody on board was wearing a life jacket, and those in the water could only grasp at anything that was buoyant and hold on to it. The 47-year-old Olivebank quickly sank. Fortunately for some of the crew, the ship had sunk in shallow water with a heavy list to port. With the 4 upper top gallant yards sticking up out of the water for about 3 meters and pointing skywards. 7 of the crew managed to reach it and lash themselves onto it. But they had to wait there all night and most of the next day in the cold waters of the North Sea before rescue arrived. Eventually, a trawler named Talona, whose skipper was Captain Soren Hansen, approached the sunken wreck. He took the 7 survivors off and landed them at Esbjerg. 14 men had perished in the sinking, with Captain Carl Graneth being one of them. This four-masted barque had lain undisturbed for 57 years, until she was discovered in June of 1996 by St. Albans Sub-Aqua Club divers. Despite the hardships of life, the Olivebank has become well known as she lasted for a long time.